Hey there, I'm Danny Trester from Trester Tailor in Rochester, Minnesota. This is Tailor It Yourself. In this video, I'm going to show you how to shorten the length or the hem on a pair of jeans or casual style pant by doing what's called an original hem, or also a Euro hem. This technique will allow us to preserve the original stitching and wear marks that were on the pants and make it look like it hasn't been altered. To do an original hem, you'll need a couple of things. You'll want a scissors to cut the excess off. You'll want a ruler and tailor's chalk to mark where our hems are going to go. And you'll want some thread that matches the blue part of the jeans. Some larger items that you'll want is a sewing machine, a serger if you have one, or a sewing machine that does a zigzag stitch. And then to press it, we'll need an ironing board or a flat surface with a towel, and then an iron with some steam. The first step to doing a hem is transferring the marks that we've made when we did our fitting to the rest of the pants so that we have lines that we know where we're going to do the hem. Doing an original hem is a little bit different than a rolled hem. On a rolled hem, we measure for extra fabric after the mark where we want our hem to be. On an original hem, we kind of go above that because we're going to take off the old hem and then put it back on. So we're essentially adding length. So it's going to be a little bit different than measuring for a regular hem. Before you mark your lines, you want to make sure that you've lined up the pants from the side seam to side seam. This is going to make sure that the lines are even front to back. Sometimes you have to kind of shake them out a little bit to get them to line up. And then you lay them back on the table. So then we'll make sure our chalk marks go to the edge of the fabric of the fold so that it's a little bit easier to see. And then we'll line up the two lines against one another. So then we'll take our ruler, and that'll be the edge of where we make our chalk mark so we know where to go. When you're marking a hem, one thing you want to make note of is if there is a taper to the pant, you want to kind of account for that. So if we just put the ruler flat on here and mark that, there might be a peak a little bit on the front and the back. So to make sure we don't have that, we'll sort of grab the pants a little bit further up the leg and bring that in. And that's sort of this peak that the pants have is going to flatten out a little bit. It's a pretty minor thing, but sometimes you have a really tapered pant and it's very obvious. This one has it just a little bit, so that's going to help us make sure that the line is the same all the way around. So once we've done that, and it's laying nice and straight, we'll lay our ruler where our chalk marks are, and then take our tailor's chalk and run it up and down the ruler to transfer that mark to the rest of the pant. And then we'll flip the one leg over and mark that on the insides. And again, flip it over and mark it on the bottom. So now there should be chalk marks all the way around both legs. And sometimes on the bottom it's a little bit less defined, so you can always go back over that with your chalk and ruler and really make that defined. So if we had not pinched the leg, there could have been a little peak kind of like that, or like that. And we don't want that. We want a nice straight line all the way across. So by sort of pinching that leg, that helps to correct that. So this measurement here is going to be our finished hem length. And like I said, because we're going to take off the existing hem and put it back on, we want to measure up from this measurement because we're going to be essentially adding fabric back on. So on a normal rolled hem, it seems odd because you want to go and leave length so that you can make the hem. But since the hem is already made, we're going to be adding it back on. We don't want the hem to end up too long. We want to make sure that we go up from where the finished measurement is. So to avoid confusion and to make sure that you've got the right finished length when you're done, I usually take a ruler and measure the length of the ruler and make a mark on the leg. So when I'm done, I can check this measurement, and if it's 12 inches or whatever the length that you choose is, I just do it because it's the whole length of the ruler. And then I don't have to remember specifically a number because sometimes you get busy and sidetracked. This is going to be my benchmark to check that I've done it right. So now I'll do the same thing on the inseam of the other pant. So now I know when I'm done, I can check this measurement up here to where our finished hem is. And if it's 12 inches, we know we've measured correctly. So as I said, because we're going to be adding fabric back on, we're going to go up and measure another line, and that's going to be the line where we sew the hem back on. And this measurement depends on the width of the hem. If you've got a wide hem that's 1 inch or 1.5 inches, you're going to want to measure the width of the hem up from where our finished hem line is, if that makes sense, because we're going to be adding that back on. So we have to make sure we subtract that from the length of the pant because we're putting that back on. So this jean measures 1/2 inch for its hem, and that's pretty typical of this style of pant. On jeans or casual style pants, they usually have 1/2 inch, but sometimes they go up to 1 inch, 1.25 inches. So we'll measure from our marked line where our finished hem is going to be 1/2 inch up because we're going to be adding that 1/2 inch back on. And then we'll do the same process where we'll mark all the legs. So we'll kind of make sure we have our pinch there. And then we'll mark that and flip through all the layers and making sure there's marks all the way around on both legs. And again, the bottom might be a little undefined, so you can run back over that and sharpen that line up a little bit. So one last thing you want to do before you cut the scraps off is I like to make markings to denote which scrap goes to which leg, because the pant leg is not symmetrical from side seam to side seam. When you try to sew the legs back on, sometimes if you can get them confused and you try to sew it on and it doesn't fit because the seams aren't lining up. I make distinct markings so I know which scrap goes to which leg. So on one I'll put X's, and another I'll make kind of this little stick line so that I know these go to those. So now that we've got everything prepped and marked, we'll cut off the hems and then prep it to sew it back on. Now that we've got our hems cut off, we'll need to encase the raw edges so that they don't fray when they're washed and worn. There's two ways that you can do that. One is to use a serger, which is what we have here. The other way is to use the zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. I'll show you how to do both. If you don't have a serger, that's okay. It'll work just fine with the zigzag stitch. If you're not familiar with a serger, it's a machine that has multiple threads that stitch at the same time and sort of wrap the edge of the fabric so that the little edges are cut off at the same time and you get a really nice clean finish on there. You can get similar thing with a zigzag stitch on the sewing machine, but it just doesn't have as much of a clean finish as it would with a serger. So from now on, we'll be working with the pants inside out, and we want to make sure that we've got the correct scrap with our leg, because I'm going to show you how to do half of it with the zigzag and half of it with the serger. I want to make sure that I do both with the same method so that they match together. These parts have the X's on them, so we'll do these with the serger, and the one with the little stick mark we'll do with the zigzag. I've put navy thread on the machine. It doesn't really matter what you use because the scraps are going to be on the inside. You're not going to see that, but I like to try to match as close as I can. So navy kind of matches the blue jeans a little bit better. Also, our stitch length, you're going to want something that's kind of middle of the road. You don't want a really small serge that is going to stitch in one little spot, and if there's especially stretch in the jeans, it'll pull it and stretch it out. And you don't want something that's so wide in between that it doesn't properly encase the raw edges and you get a bunch of fraying. So kind of in between will work really well for this. So you can put your scrap on your machine, and the really cool thing about a serger is that it will cut. It has this blade here. It will cut as we sew, so we don't have to worry about cutting all this excess off. We'll just kind of push and angle the scrap so that the foot comes in line with this old rolled hem here. And I like to do this with the outside facing down so that we can push our foot further into here and we get a nice cleaner line, and it's easier to go over some of these thicker seams when you do it from the inside of the scrap. So you just kind of go around. Once you get to that foot there, just kind of keep the foot running along the edge of that rolled hem. And I go a little bit past where we started so that we get a nice clean line here. Because we sewed this on the inside, sometimes if you sew it like this, you'll get like a little bump on the thicker seams if you have a really thick seam. So by sewing it with the inside facing you, the foot can go over these thicker seams a little easier. So you get a nice cleaner cut there. So now we'll do our leg and we'll start on the inseam. And this one we don't want to cut anything off because we've already got our cut edge. So we're just going to run that blade along the edge that's already been cut. So we got a nice even line on there. And it's really sharp and clipped all those edges off. So now that we've got this leg serged, I'll show you how to do it on the other leg using the zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. To do the zigzag, you'll want to set your stitch length to something that is about 1/8 of an inch apart from one another and then about 1/4 inch wide. You want something that is going to be wide enough that it encases the edge of the fabric and won't pull out. And you don't want to do it too close that you're sewing in one spot and might get a thread jam. So you can take a piece of fabric as scrap and sort of play around with your settings and try to figure out what works for you. This one I was previously making a buttonhole, so it's a very small stitch. We want it a little bit bigger than that. So I think that will work pretty well. We've got about 1/8 of an inch in between the stitches, and then it's about 1/4 of an inch wide. We could go a little bit wider, but I think that'll work well for our purposes. This machine is just a regular straight stitch zigzag machine and does not have a cutting blade, so we'll need to cut the scrap before we can sew that raw edge. So you'll want to cut about 1/2 inch up from where the old hem stitching line is. We don't want to get it too narrow. We don't want to go any smaller than 1/4 of an inch, but 1/2 inch is ideal. So the width of the hem on this one is 1/2 inch, so we'll kind of go by that. And then we'll just take a scissors and go around and cut that. All right. And again, to make sure we're corresponding the correct leg with our scrap. This is our kind of weird stick line and then our weird stick line. So we've got those. So we'll take our scrap and working from the inside, we'll make sure that our zigzag needle is lined up all the way to the right. When it's all the way to the right, that it's lined up with the edge of our scrap. And then we'll just go all the way around. And when you're zigzagging, you want to make sure that you're catching just the edge of that fabric so that we can maximize our stitch width across the fabric. And you can see how that's encasing that edge there. Alright, so now we've got our scrap zigzagged and secured, and you may find there's some little threads that get pulled out as you're sewing, but you can just snip those. It should be fine. And now we'll do our pant leg. So now that we've got everything secured, we can attach our scrap back onto the rest of the pant and recreate the hem. The thread that we put on is a thread that matches the outside fabric, whatever blue color that is. There's an extra step in here that you don't have to do, but that I like to do that I'll show you in a bit. But it's important that the thread that you use matches the outside so that it can camouflage itself as best as possible. So we'll take our scrap to our corresponding pant leg. This one has a weird stick mark, whatever you want to call that. So what you want to do is, again, working with the pants inside out, you'll want to put the right sides together. And by that I mean the sides that are going to be visible on the outside, you want to put those so that they're touching each other. And we want to line up our seams. So this inseam on the scrap has this top stitching, so we'll match it up with the inseam on here. And these are the two sides that are going to be visible, so we'll put those together. And another thing that you could do to make sure it's everything lines up properly is if you hold these together, you can see that the stitching on here lines up with the stitching on this pant. You want to hold those where they are lined up, and then sometimes you can put a pin through there, and that will help hold it together so that when you sew it doesn't shift and that they'll line up and look like it's one of those little tricks that make it look like it hasn't been altered. So then we'll put this under our machine, and for our stitch length, you want a kind of a medium stitch length, not super long, not super short. You don't want to sew in the same spot. I've got mine set about 3.5, which is 3.5 millimeters, but anywhere from 2 to 3.5 would be fine. When we start sewing this, we will sew just to the right of that old stitch line where that gold is, but we want to sew on this blue part here, not on the inside scrap part, the whiter part, but we want to sew just along that stitch line. And when we flip that over, our seam, we're going to be creating a seam basically, is going to be right above that stitch line. So it's important that you stitch right along there and not too far onto this scrap here. So we'll sink our needle to get started and roll over the seams a little bit by turning the wheel because it's a little bit thick and you don't want to break a needle. And then what you also want to do is line up the stitch line on your scrap with the marked chalk line that we made. So as you can see, this is lined up, the stitch line is lined up with our chalk mark there. And it's a little bit easier on this specific one because we've made our scrap allowance a 1/2 inch, and then our chalk mark is a 1/2 inch from this edge here. So the fact that they're both 1/2 inch, you can pretty much just put the two raw edges together and they'll line up along our chalk marks. So we'll just go ahead and stitch forward. Again, just to the right of that old stitch line. And before you get too far, you want to make sure that you're lining up the seams on the side so that those line up as well. We could put a pin through there. If we take our pin out and we look, those seams are lining up great. If we take our pin out from our start point, those seams have lined up pretty well. So we'll just keep going, making sure we're lining up our chalk mark with where our stitch line is. And we're stitching, again, right to the right of that old stitch line on this blue part. And again, I'm walking the wheel over that side seam because it's a little thicker there. And if we turn it inside out, we can see that the seam is right above that old stitch line. So it's really going to camouflage the fact that we've added a seam there. And our side seams line up and that seam lines up really well. So we'll do one extra step, and you don't have to do this, but I find that it's really helpful to make sure that everything lays kind of flat, because when you do an original hem, you're adding layers of fabric to the inside of the hem and it can get a little bulky. Also, over time, that seam allowance that we have here, that can flip down and can be visible. So in order to keep that up and to keep everything lying flat, I like to top stitch or stitch along the top part of the seam that we've just made above the old stitch line. So that's why it's important to have matching thread color, because it's really going to camouflage that stitch line that you won't see that, but it will lay nice and flat. So again, we'll start at the inseam and sink our needle, and I'm using my hands to sort of pull apart the two pieces of fabric so that the stitch line doesn't get buried in there and is still visible. And then I'm just going to go around separating that seam. So as you can see, that stitch line we've made just there is barely visible, especially when it's down at the floor when someone's wearing it. No one's ever gonna see that, but it's just one extra tip so that it lays nice and flat. So if you turn the pant leg inside out a little bit, you can see that even though we haven't pressed this, it's laying nice and flat, and that's something that you really want. Because like I said, when you do the original hem, you're adding layers and bulk to it, so you want it to lay as nicely as possible. And then one extra thing that we'll want to do is tack our side seams. We're going to kind of stitch in the ditch or stitch in where that seam is, and that's just one extra thing that's going to make sure that these seam allowances don't flop down and they stay where they should. So you can just lay that under the machine and then line your needle up with where the seam is, and then stitch back and forth a few times. And then we'll go to the inseam. And this one's a little bit different because it has the seam allowance lapped to one side. So we'll just go to the very side of where that seam is and stitch a few times. And because our thread color matches so well, no one's gonna see that anyhow. Now that we've finished with the one leg, we'll repeat those steps and do the other. So again, checking our marks, this one's an X, this one's an X. Even though we've already sewn the other one and we've already checked our marks, we just kind of want to double check. Sometimes you never know. So these both have X's on them. So we'll take our inseam on the jeans and the inseam on the scrap and line those up. And we want to line up the seams. You could put a pin there to hold them together. And then we're going to stitch just to the right of that old stitch line. Make sure we're lining up our old stitch line with the chalk mark or the edges of our fabric. I'm just noticing this here. These are the ones that we've serged, and this is the one that we've zigzagged. You can see that the one that we've serged secures the raw edges a little bit better. This one, again, will do a fine job. Just over time you might get some of these little fuzzies, but a serger does work really nicely and is a lot more clean finish. And we're just gonna go all the way around the leg, making sure everything's lined up. We're lined up just to the right of that stitching. We're gonna make sure that our side seam is lined up when we get to there, so all those seams line up. So our inseam lines up and the outseam lines up pretty well. Sometimes if you just kind of pull on it, it'll line up just fine. So yeah, that's pretty good there. So now we will go and do our top stitching so that it lays nice and flat. And again, I'm pulling the two pieces apart so that it lays nice and flat and the stitching is visible. It should say the old hemline is visible. You don't want it to get buried in the seam there and then you can't see it, and then that defeats the purpose of doing the original hem. And again, we'll tack up our side seams. And there you can see our top stitching line isn't visible, and everything's laying nice and flat. So now that we've got everything sewn back together, we'll double check the measurement we made earlier to make sure that we've got the correct length, and we'll give it a press. Before we press, we're going to turn our pants right side out so that we can check the measurement we made on the side seams just to make sure that we've got the correct length. So flip them inside out, or right side out. And you can take your ruler, whatever you used earlier to determine that length, and double check that. And on this one, we've got 12 inches is what we marked for. And the other is also 12 inches, so we're spot on for where we should be for the length. We know we've done a good job making sure that we've measured and marked everything correctly. So now to press it, I'm going to turn them right inside out again, so that we can get the iron right on that seam we just sewed, so it lays nice and flat. So you just want to put that in there, use the weight and steam of the iron to press that flat, get off any left behind chalk marks. And then we'll turn them right side out and just press the outside again. Get rid of any chalk marks that we have on here. There are a number of ways that you can do an original hem. One of the ways I've seen is by taking apart the old hem and inserting this seam allowance underneath that and then stitching it back together. For me, that sort of defeats the purpose of an original hem. The purpose is to preserve the old stitch line and the wear lines on there. So if you're taking that stitching out, it may be hard to duplicate again. If you also do it that way, you're going to make the hem that's already a little bit bulky because you've got a couple rolls of fabric on the inside. You're going to add in 2 extra layers, so that's going to create even more bulk. So instead of spreading that thickness out from here through the hem, having this all be one thickness here, it's just going to make a super bulky hem. So doing that way defeats the purpose of keeping the stitching, and it makes the hem at the very bottom a little bit more bulky. So if you do it this way, where you stitch up and top stitch the seam allowances on the inside flat, this will lay nice and crisp, and it'll really disguise that seam that we've put on there and make it look like it hasn't been altered. For more information and courses, including downloadable PDFs, visit our website at tailorityourself.com. And always remember, measure twice, cut once. Thanks for watching.